Today's encouragement comes from Daniel chapter 6, because this is the chapter of the Daniel in the lion's den. You remember the song, Daniel was a man of prayer. Daily he prayed 3 times, even when they had him cast in the den of lions. In the den, fears could not alarm him. God just shut the lion's mouth so they could not harm him. But when I was reading this chapter, I was really challenged by some things as we see in the passage here in Daniel chapter 6. The first 3 verses, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, whom should be over the kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts to them, and the king should have no damage. Assuming that this role of government official and the president involved the taxes, and Daniel was likely to be chosen to oversee this particular work. But then verse 3, this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and the princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. And here we see that Daniel's reputation at work was of the highest character. We see the consistency of Daniel. Daniel is now an older man. He's now in his late 80s, 90s possibly. And now we see that he has been faithful in his service. And that's one thing that every person will notice about someone who's a Christian. If they're faithful to their work and they're consistent in their work, that's a huge thing that employees really value. And as Christians, we should be those who have the best reputation for work. Of course, that's one of the ways we can be of influence in our jobs, is by our character. And of course, we're familiar with the chapter. The other presidents, or the ones likely to be chosen, got jealous, so they go to the king and set up this law which appeals to the king's ego, and say no one's to pray to any god for 30 days except to you, the king. And of course, the king, not thinking through what this meant for Daniel, agreed to the law. And of course, this was a trap for Daniel. And it's quite interesting when we read verses 10 and 11 what Daniel did. We read now, when Daniel had signed the writing, or when Daniel knew that writing was signed rather, he went to his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. But here we see the consistency of Daniel. And someone has said, I think it was David Jeremiah, said Daniel valued his time with the Lord more than the trip to the lion's den. And that's very challenging for us as Christians. Do we value our daily time with the Lord more than what it costs not to do it? And for Daniel, he really valued that, and I found that very challenging. And particularly, it's interesting in verse 11, then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. What really struck me was that the other presidents knew where Daniel prayed. They knew how many times he prayed, and they knew he was a man of prayer. And whilst in verse 3 it's his character that stands out, in verse 10 and 11 it's his conviction. His conviction was so much that he wanted to spend that time with the Lord. I think it's Psalm 55, evening, noon and night, the Lord will hear me and he will answer my voice. And we read that in Psalm 55, I think it's verse 16 and 17. And that may well be describing the 3 times that Daniel prayed 3 times a day. And I wonder, the challenge is for me and every Christian, how many times a day have you spent that time of devotion to the Lord? It seems that this was a habit, and prayer really is a habit, but it's a good habit. It's a habit that Daniel obviously was disciplined to do, but also he really valued it. And I wonder if we value those times of prayer in our own life. Well, we know the story. They watched, they went back to the king, they told the king, Daniel's disobeyed your Lord, you got to throw him into the lion's den. We know, of course, that Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, so his devotion to the Lord did cost him something. But we know, as it says in verse 22, I think it is, Daniel testifies that my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. And here we see that God preserved Daniel in this particular case. He doesn't always preserve those that are truly committed to him. Across this world, many Christians are losing their life, or families, or the church is being burnt down or being persecuted because of their devotion to the Lord, and that is the challenge for us. But then verse 23, we read, the king was glad because Daniel came out of the den alive. And then we read, no hurt was found upon Daniel because he believed in his God. And it was his faith in the living God that preserved Daniel. And of course Hebrews chapter 11 speaks about by faith they shut the mouths of lions, and that of course is referring at least to Daniel chapter 6 and maybe to other passages in our Bible as well. So here we see not only the character of Daniel. He had an excellent spirit, had a great attitude, outstanding attitude, not only the consistency of the conviction of Daniel, but also his consistency. From the start of the book, Daniel chapter 1, where he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's food, and then here to chapter 6, and that marked Daniel right throughout his life, was his consistency. And remember that the Lord values faithfulness. Matthew 25 verse 21, we should be serving God to hear the well done of God, well done good and faithful servant. And I'm sure Daniel heard that when he finished his work, and will we hear that voice from God when we finish our work? So that's the challenge, the character of Daniel, the conviction of Daniel, his prayer time, and the consistency of Daniel. Trust you'll be encouraged and challenged by this video. Thank you for listening.